Thank you for joining me for this evening's Learning About Lichens, Introduction to Biology and Ecology of Common Colorado Species. I'm Megan Wilbar, Museum Curator for the InfoZone Museum at the Rawlings Library. And joining me tonight, as you'll see, is Peg Rooney, President of the Arkansas Valley Audubon Society, and Piper Boudart, which I'm butchering your name and I know it, I just asked you, sorry, our distinguished presenter for this evening. And this is also a tongue twister, but I'm going to read it anyway. Piper graduated summa cum laude from Colorado College this past May. She has a bachelor's degree in orgasmal biology and ecology, and completed her honors thesis titled Community Phylogenetics of Lichens in the Flat Tops Wilderness Area of Colorado. She's participated in several Colorado Springs BioBlitz events as a botanist and continued her scientific outreach in Colorado. She's currently working as the Director of Agricultural Safety for Moon Valley Nurseries in Arizona, and she joins us tonight from Arizona. So thank you both for being here this evening. Piper will be answering questions at the end, so please write your comments in the comment section of whatever platform you're watching from as you think of them, and she'll answer them at the end of the presentation. I'm going to turn the screen over to Dr. Peg Rooney, who you know from these series of programs. She has a deep passion for birds and the environment. She spearheaded this entire series that began about 3 months ago, and we're already booking into 2021. So stay tuned with the library for future programs, and also with the Arkansas Valley Audubon Society. Peg, I'm going to turn it over to you, and so you can tell us more about the Audubon Society, and then we'll turn it over to Piper. So
Sure.
thank you both.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Megan. I want to welcome you here tonight and encourage you to take a stand for birds. Every single day, there's a new threat against birds and their habitats and the environment in general. So as you consider your vote in November, I would ask you to be aware of where the candidates stand on environmental issues and their concern for wildlife. And vote accordingly. I would also encourage you to join the Arkansas Valley Audubon Society so we can leverage our voices to protect birds and their habitats. And you can find membership information on our website at socobirds.org. So Southern Colorado Birds, abbreviated SOCO Birds, socobirds.org. All right, and now I'll turn it over to Piper.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for taking part of your evening to come learn about lichens with me. So as Megan said, I just finished up my final year at Colorado College, and this included my senior thesis project in which I studied lichens in the Flat Tops Wilderness area of Colorado. So when I started out at Colorado College, I knew that I had a great curiosity about lichens. I loved taking pictures of them and looking at them in nature, but I really didn't know that much about them. And so the very first task that my wonderful thesis advisor, Dr. Rachel Jabali, assigns to me was to write a review paper about many different aspects of lichenology. So I wanted to take this opportunity today to share some of that foundational knowledge with you all. So this will include questions such as, what is a lichen? And where do these lichens live? How do they grow and survive? What are lichens used for? And which lichens are common in Colorado? So let's start today with the most basic question, what is a lichen? And I always start with this question because a lot of people don't know what a lichen is. You may have seen them. They come in a variety of different forms, colors, shapes, and sizes. But the typical biology classroom doesn't really cover what a lichen is because it falls through the cracks sometimes. It's not a plant, it's not an animal. It's just not something people are very familiar with. So let's take a moment to look further into what a lichen is. And it's not actually a single organism. Rather, it is two or more organisms living together in an obligate symbiotic relationship. So this is simply an interaction between two different organisms living in close physical association. And this is typically advantageous to both participants. So when we think about a symbiotic relationship, the examples that normally come to mind involve animals. So you might think of a clownfish and an anemone, or you might think of a bird and an animal species that benefit from each other. But what's really cool about lichens is that they are a symbiotic relationship that involves a fungus and an algal component. So it's a little bit different than the examples we normally think about. But it involves these fungal tissues and either a green algae or a cyanobacterium. And there's still a lot of research going into what other components exist in a lichen symbiotic relationship. So we have evidence for the existence of some Basidiomycetes yeasts. There's existence of different bacteria. But in the most basic form, every single lichen that you come across will have both a mycobiont and a photobiont. So the mycobiont is the fungal portion of the lichen symbiosis, and it's a really diverse section of fungi. There's over 19,000 species of fungus that can participate in these lichenized relationships, and they come from nearly 1,000 different genera. So from an evolutionary perspective, this is a very diverse section of fungus, and it has evolved multiple times from multiple different lichen families. So it's a really cool relationship that has really stood that test of evolutionary time. And it's important to note that the lichen species is based purely on this fungal portion. So all of the species names, the scientific names, all of those evolutionary relationships are based on the fungus. And the fungus is responsible for providing both the internal and the external structure of the lichen. So whenever you look at a lichen, you are looking at a majority of fungal material. And its role is first to acquire mineral nutrients from the substrate. So the lichen is able to absorb these minerals and share them with the algae. And perhaps more importantly, the fungus is responsible for creating a suitable microhabitat for its photobiont partner. So essentially, the fungus builds a house for the algae to live in, which is really important to protect the algae from the threat of desiccation or drying out, and also UV radiation from the sun. And so when we take a look at the photobiont, it's a much less diverse set of organisms. So these are either a photosynthetic algae or cyanobacteria, which come from 25 genera of green algae and 12 genera of cyanobacteria. And as the name implies, the role of the photobiont is to produce carbohydrates via photosynthesis. So it's taking energy from the sun, converting it into sugars, and then sharing those sugars with the fungus. And as I alluded to before, the photobiont is very susceptible to desiccation and UV damage. So if this algal component dries out, it can no longer perform photosynthesis. So that's why it's so beneficial to the fungus to protect its algal partners so that it continues photosynthesizing and providing food. And what's cool about the photobiont is that you can distinguish it visually. So you can see here in this cross section, those bright green cells are all algal cells. You can tell they're green algae based on their color, and if this lichen had a cyanobacteria photobiont, those cells would be darker blue-green or black in color. So when we take a look at how these two components come together, you can see this cross-section of a lichen where that very thin layer of algae exists near the upper surface, and then there's a white cottony portion of fungal matter below. So when we look at this microscopic image, you can see those fungal hyphae, or the fungal filaments, wrap around each algal cell to hold it in place. So this is the basic structure of all lichens that you come across. They'll have this upper cortex of densely packed fungal filaments, and then that photobiont layer where photosynthesis occurs, and then the medulla, or that broader white portion, which has those loosely packed fungal filaments. And so this structure will vary a little bit based on the different species and growth forms of lichens. So there are three primary growth forms that lichens will take on, and we will highlight those today. So those are the Foliose, Fruticose, and Crustose growth forms. First, we have the Foliose growth form, which is a leaf-like growth form that has a flattened body with distinct upper and lower surfaces. So these lichens attach to their substrate, or the surface below them, in one of two ways. The first, the rhizomate lichens, attach to their substrate via structures called rhizines, which resemble roots. These are the most complex lichens of all the anatomy types, and that allows them to sustain growth of up to 1/2 meter in diameter, which is very impressive. On the other hand, we have umbilicate foliose lichens, which attach to their substrate with a single holdfast, which is called an umbilicus. So some of the foliose lichens that you'll see in Colorado include the genus Umbilicaria, pictured on top, Xanthoparmelia, pictured on the lower left, and Physia. So at this point, I will make a note that we generally use the scientific names or the Latin names when discussing lichens because the common names are not that well standardized. So when you think about birds and mammals, those scientists have done a really good job of creating standardized common names so that when you use one name in North America, someone across the world using that same name will know the exact species you're talking about. But lichens don't have that luxury. They are perhaps not common enough to have those well-established common names. So that's why, for the majority of the time, we refer to them with their Latin names. So looking at the Fruticose lichens, these are characterized by their three-dimensional growth form. So they either grow upwards out of the ground like a stalk or downwards from branches like a pendant. And these are cylindrical lichens most of the time with a singular cortex enveloping their entire body. And like the umbilicate lichens, they often attach to their substrate via a central holdfast. And so in order to sustain such long or tall growth, they often have additional internal support structures to support themselves. So they have either a central skeleton of dense fungal tissue, or they hollow themselves out in the middle to make themselves lighter and more sustainable. And so the genera you'll see in Colorado include Usnea, pictured above, and Cladonia, pictured below. So the third and final growth form is the Crustose lichens, whose entire lower surface grows in direct contact with the substrate. So it's impossible to separate these lichens from their substrate without breaking them. And this is because they lack a lower cortex, and instead those fungal filaments just adhere directly to the surface beneath them. And what's really cool is that some crustose lichens have their body hidden within the substrate, and only their fruiting bodies are exposed. So you can see an example of that in this upper right-hand corner. That's a lichen whose thallus or body is hidden in the upper layers of the wood, and just those structures you see are its fruiting bodies. So the common genera you'll come across in Colorado include Rhizocarpon, Candelariella, and Lichens. And so where do these lichens live? And lichens are pretty opportunistic organisms. They can grow on such a wide variety of surfaces or substrates. So you can see here they take advantage of trees, bark, rocks, even intertidal marine zones, and an abandoned car. So these lichens are pretty opportunistic, and they have different descriptions based on the surface that they're growing on. So for example, we have saxicolous lichens that grow on rock surfaces, lignicolous lichens growing on wood surfaces, ramicolous lichens growing on twigs, and so on. And so this becomes really important to know when you're trying to identify a lichen. So for example, if you have two lichens that look almost identical, but one is growing on rock and one is growing on wood, you can start to narrow down the species identification by knowing which substrates different species are able to grow on. And so in addition to being able to grow on a variety of different surfaces, lichens can grow in a broad variety of ecosystems throughout the world. And so lichens can grow on all 7 continents, ranging from the coldest portions of the Arctic to very hot deserts. And they are just very hardy and adaptable organisms. So looking at the Arctic lichens pictured in the top row, we see that they have those more three-dimensional growth forms. They are either fruticose or foliose, and for lichens, they're pretty big. And this is because in the Arctic, there's enough snowmelt and humidity in the air to support these lichens with moisture to photosynthesize and expand. And in the Arctic, we actually see that lichens are often the dominant vegetation type. So a lot of your vascular plants can't tolerate such cold temperatures, whereas lichens are able to handle them, making them kind of the superior competitors in that habitat. When you look at the desert lichens in the bottom row, you notice right away that they are much smaller structures. You can see the scale in those photographs is just 1 millimeter in width, And these lichens are very flat. They're very closely oppressed to the rocks beneath them. And that's because they are so limited by moisture that they don't have enough moisture in their bodies to sustain these larger growth forms. If they were to grow so large and have so much surface area exposed, they would dry up right away. And so you can see this really interesting variation in lichen growth forms based on the ecosystem they're in. So how do these lichens establish themselves? And we'll see oftentimes lichens are the very first organism to colonize a bare rock surface. And this is a unique ability that lichens have that many other vegetative organisms don't, because vascular plants require soil to establish themselves, but lichens are able to adhere their fungal tissues directly to the rock surface below them, which gives them a huge competitive advantage in early successional stages. And so we see that over time, lichens, as they interact with the surface beneath them, they start to slowly degrade that substrate, which ends up creating soil. And when you create soil, you open the door for competition from bryophytes, which are mosses, and vascular plants. So when you look at the successional timeline, you start with a bare rock, which is colonized by lichens, which creates soil, and which opens up competition for mosses and vascular plants to come and start coexisting with those lichens. But this whole process can take centuries to happen, and that's because lichens grow incredibly slowly. So a crustose lichen growing on a rock surface might only expand 0.5 millimeter each year. So if you find a crustose lichen that's several inches in diameter, chances are pretty good that it's older than you. And this actually enables them to live to be thousands of years old. So I find it pretty cool that there's lichens on this planet that are 10,000 years old. It's a really cool trait of theirs that a lot of other vegetative organisms don't share. And so how do lichens manage to survive in such taxing environments? And they actually have a couple things working against them. First, they lack a waxy cuticle. So if you imagine a typical plant leaf, it has that waxy coating on its surface, which is designed to minimize evaporation of water out of the leaf. But lichens don't have that waxy coating, so that the water inside them can very easily evaporate back into the atmosphere. And so to compensate for this, lichens are poikilohydric organisms, which simply means they can tolerate significant fluctuations in moisture. So when they dry out or desiccate entirely, they can actually enter a dormant state for weeks or months at a time, where they cease metabolic processes, they stop photosynthesis, they stop growing, but soon as they're rehydrated, they can resume those processes. Additionally, lichens lack roots and vascular structures. So again, imagine a plant and it is able to put down its roots deep into the soil looking for water and nutrient sources. And then it can use those roots and its veins to transport water from the roots all the way up to the highest leaves. Lichens, on the other hand, don't have any roots and they don't have any vasculature. So even if one side of the lichen body is wet, the other side a couple inches away might still be dry. And so again, to compensate for this, lichens are able to absorb water directly from the air, which is a really cool ability. Additionally, they can absorb nutrients directly through the air in their upper surfaces. So this helps to make up for the lack of roots. Additionally, lichens contain chemicals, which are known as secondary compounds or lichen substances. A very common one is usnic acid, which absorbs UV rays to protect the lichen from UV radiation. So essentially, it serves as sunscreen for the lichen. Another common chemical is parietin, which filters the light to create optimal conditions for photosynthesis. So this just makes photosynthesis as efficient as possible without damaging the lichen. Other chemical compounds can serve as herbivory deterrents, so preventing insects and arthropods from eating the lichen surfaces, as well as germination inhibition. So lichens might be able to stop neighboring plant seeds from sprouting using their chemical compounds, which will prevent any competition from those neighboring plants. And finally, some of these lichen compounds act as antibacterial substances. And so these chemicals are very important to lichen survival, and they're also important to species identification. So There are different chemical spot tests that lichenologists use to reveal the presence or absence of certain chemicals in a lichen body, because some species will have chemical A while other species have chemical B. And so, for instance, you can put a drop of potassium hydride on the lichen surface in the medulla, and it will change colors depending on what chemical is present. So that's a really cool application. But these same chemicals can actually be lethal for some of the organisms living with lichens. So for instance, in 2004, there was a herd of 300 elk that died of paralysis in Wyoming. And after several weeks of investigation, it was determined that this was actually the result of lichen poisoning. So a lichen species in the genus Parmelia contains this specific acid that breaks down muscle tissue, which led to the death of all of these elk. What's really interesting is that the native elk were unaffected. So these 300 elk that came in, they came further than their native range. So they died because of this chemical, but the native elk had microorganisms in their gut bioflora, which is capable of breaking down the acid. So that's just a really cool example, albeit very sad, of these interactions between lichens and other species in their habitats. And so how do lichens reproduce? And this is a pretty complex question because remember, lichens are not a single organism. They require two different organisms living together, and that means two organisms reproducing together. So it's a pretty complicated phenomenon, especially because that photobiont stops sexual reproduction once it's lichenized. So right off the bat, there's a complication. The mycobiont, or the fungus, continues sexual reproduction, but this leads to some opportunities for mismatch on several scales. So first of all, we have sexually reproduced fungal spores, but we don't have any sexually reproduced algal cells. If we do have asexual algal cells and sexual fungal spores, those might both be released, but maybe they're released at different times, or maybe they're released at the same time, but they're unable to find themselves in the environment. So sexual reproduction is not a very guaranteed method of reproduction for lichen species. And so to compensate for this, lichens have developed several means of asexual reproduction in order to ensure that they are able to make more individuals. And so two common methods of asexual reproduction include Seridia and Isidia. So both of these structures accomplish the task of dispersing the fungus and the algae together, which is critical to starting a new symbiotic relationship. So Seridia have photobiont cells enclosed in fungal filaments, and they're spherical in shape, in a granular to flowery, and they're very small in diameter, but you can see them with the help of a hand lens. Isidia, very similarly, they have both algae and fungus, and they grow almost like mini corals on the surface of a lichen. And again, you can visualize those with a hand lens. And so these two structures are distributed into the environment to propagate new lichen individuals. And this is done both abiotically and biotically. So abiotic means of dispersal include wind and water. And several of the biotic dispersers include birds, who you can see here include portions of lichens while building their nest. So even if they just take a small piece of a lichen and carry it over to their nest, that helps the lichen establish a new colony in a novel microhabitat. Additionally, those Seridia and Isidia might stick to the feathers of birds or to the bodies of ants as they crawl through the lichens. So these are some really cool means of interactions with other species. I know sheep and pronghorn antlers are antelopes are also able to disperse lichen fragments too. And so what are lichens used for? Lichens have a host of different uses, both traditional and modern. The first of which are their use as a food source. So in the Pacific Northwest, Native Americans were known to consume willa, which is the lichen Bryoria fremontii, and it was traditionally cooked in a pit into a pudding with onions and berries. So this was kind of a black gelatinous substance that was pretty heavily relied upon as a food source when food was scarce. Similarly, in Scandinavia, they used a lichen which the common name was Iceland moss, and it's Cicharia icelandica, and this lichen was added to flour or potatoes to bulk up the food. And finally, the vagrant lichens were believed to be the manna from heaven that saved the Israelites. And so these lichens are vagrant, meaning that they don't grow attached to a substrate. They just roll in the wind, kind of like a mini tumbleweed. So these are just some cool applications of lichens as a food source. And lichens have also been used as a means of dyeing fabrics. So those same chemical compounds I mentioned earlier can be extracted and used as a dye. So this is accomplished by either boiling the lichens or soaking them in ammonia. And what's really neat is that the color of the lichen surface does not necessarily indicate the color that the dye will be. So for instance, these 3 yarns were dyed with these lichens, Xanthoria, Avernia, and Umbilicaria, and you can see that those colors don't match the final result at all. So it's just a very cool process of extracting those chemicals from within the lichen and using them as an artistic property. So again, these chemicals have also been used in the development of the litmus test. So if you're familiar with litmus paper, it changes color when put in a solution to determine whether that solution is acidic or basic. And so this test was developed by extracting dyes from the lichens Ricella, which is pictured here, Dendrographa, and Parmelia. So again, there's some very cool applications for the chemicals that are naturally occurring in lichens, both in a traditional and historical sense and still applications we're using today. Lichens can also be used for their research applications. So for instance, there is a field called Lichenometry, which essentially uses lichen growth in order to determine the age of an exposed rock surface. So this is a 3-step process. First, you must identify your indicator species of lichen growing on the rock surface that you want to age. So this lichen must be crustose, and it must have radial growth, so it must grow in a circular pattern. So typically, the lichen used for this is the map lichen, Rhizocarpon geographicum. And once you have your lichen identified and picked out on the rock surface, you can then calculate the growth rate for that given species in a given environment. So you can either do this directly by documenting the growth over a period of many years to determine the rate in millimeters per year. So that's a good way to do it, but it does take some time. And then there's also an indirect method of calculating the growth rate where you measure the lichen radius on a surface of known age. So gravestones are generally used for this because you have a rock surface that was put up in a known year that was initially free of lichens. And then if you revisit it several decades later, you know how old that headstone is, and you're able to measure the width of the lichen. So if you know the radius of the lichen and how many years old that headstone is, you can calculate that growth rate in millimeters per year. And so once you have the growth rate determined, you can use that to infer the age of the rock surface. So oftentimes this technique is used for archaeological artifacts, abandoned old ancient buildings, and so on. So there are a couple techniques for this. The first being the maximum diameter lichenometry, which is used to date structures that were initially lichen-free. So essentially, you're looking for the largest lichens on these rock surfaces because the largest lichens will be the oldest. And once you know how large they are, using that growth rate in millimeters per year, you can calculate the age of that lichen. If you are looking at a structure that was built with rocks that already had lichen growth on them, there is a method called size frequency regression, which can be used to determine the point in time at which those rocks were moved to build that structure. So this is a really cool application. It's been used more frequently in Europe, and it's been determined that it's pretty accurate for artifacts that are up to 1,000 years old. So that's just a cool application of using lichens to study another research question. And so finally today, I wanted to leave you all with some common Colorado lichens that you could go on a hike tomorrow and hopefully recognize after this presentation, because I know as a biologist, as birders, one of our favorite things is being able to go out into nature and see an organism and say, oh, I recognize that species. I know a little bit about its biology. There's just something inherently fun about that process. So here's a couple lichens that are very common to Colorado that you'll be able to identify. The first is the map lichen that I mentioned earlier. So that's Rhizocarpon geographicum, which is a crustose lichen with angular scales. So if you look at those little scales composing the lichen body, you can see that they're not perfectly round. And this is a saxicolous lichen growing on rocks that has a bright green to yellow body. And it has this black ring surrounding the extent of the lichen. So that's a key feature to keep an eye out for. The ascoma are the fruiting bodies of the fungus. So in this case, you can see them. They are those black angular portions of the lichen body, and that's where the fungal spores are being produced. So as I said, this map lichen is saxicolous, so it only grows on rock surfaces. You won't find it growing on tree trunks. And it is common in coniferous regions between 3,000 and 12,000 feet in altitude. And it has a slight preference for south-facing slopes. So you can see another image of it here. It's a pretty beautiful lichen, one of the brighter lichens that we have here in Colorado. My personal favorite lichen in Colorado is Rhizoplaca chrysoleuca, which is the Rockbright lichen, and it is a foliose lichen with that umbilicate attachment. So it attaches to the rock at a single point, and it has a body that is greenish yellow to whitish gray in color and tan to dark brown underneath. And so my favorite part about this lichen are its ascoma, are those fungal fruiting bodies. So you can see here, they are peach to orange in color, and they're just beautiful. They're very abundant, varying in sizes and shapes a little bit, but very eye-catching. And again, this is a saxicolous lichen growing on rock surfaces, and it shows a preference for certain rock types. So lichens can be kind of picky about the rocks that they live on. Certain types of rocks have different acidity levels, different porosity. So again, you can use rock type to start to narrow down which lichen you're looking at. This lichen is very common in pinyon juniper woodlands to alpine regions, and it's nitrophilous, which means that it likes growing where there's a lot of nitrogen. So for example, nitrophilous lichens are often found growing beneath birds' nests because bird feces contain a lot of nitrogen. So if you're looking for nitrophilous lichens, a good place to look is where the birds are hanging out. Another really fun lichen in Colorado is Cladonia. Those are the Pixie cup lichens. And they're unique because they have a primary and a secondary body. So the primary body is that low-growing foliose form. And the secondary portion is the Fruticose stalk that grows upwards out of the primary body. And there's a lot of species in Colorado that are green to brown in color, and they may produce those Siridia asexual propagules. Their fruiting bodies are located at the tips of those stalks, and they're red to brown. And these lichens are unique because you can pretty much guarantee that they'll be growing in soil, in rotting wood, in moss clumps at the bases of trees. So if you're ever in a more coniferous region of Colorado that has a lot of mosses growing, just look at the base of a tree that's kind of rotting away, and you're likely to find these Pixie cup lichens because they're very moisture dependent. So you won't find them in the more arid regions of Colorado. And finally, we have the genus Usnea, which are the beard lichens, which are a really fun lichen. Again, you'll find them growing in those coniferous forests in Colorado, and they dangle down from the twigs of those pine trees. And so sometimes you can find them growing on rocks, but most of the time, look for them, and they can be pretty long. They have this fruticose, three-dimensional growth form with a central holdfast, and they can either be kind of short and shrubby or very long and pendant. So you can find them growing upwards of a foot long in the forests. They're unique in that they have a round cross-section that's elastic when you pull it apart. So if you ever find one of these laying on the ground, just pull on a branch and you'll see that it's elastic in the center. And the guys will have that frosty green to yellowish color. And so lastly today, I just wanted to leave you with some of my favorite resources and further reading if you want to continue learning about lichens. So these are books and resources that were very instrumental to me while I was going about my thesis research. So we have a lot of field guides. The field guide to the lichens of the White Rocks is a recent publication from Dr. Aaron Tripp up at the University of Boulder, Colorado. So that's a fantastic field guide to a pretty specific area. The photographs and descriptions are wonderful. Again, those other field guides are a great resource if you just want to take something into the field with you to recognize some of the species that you're seeing. So I want to thank you all so much for coming to this presentation. And if you have any questions, to type them up in the comments, and I would be more than happy to answer them. Okay, so it looks like we have a couple questions. What's the difference between a green algae and a cyanobacterium? And those are just different taxa, different organisms. So they fall in different places in the organismal kingdom. So in terms of lichens, when you have a green algae as your photobiont, again, you'll see that very bright green layer. And those lichens will have a lot more of a stratified structure. So you'll see those very clear layers of fungus, then algae, then more fungus below. But when you look at a cyanobacterium lichen, they are often called the jelly lichens. When they're wet, they become gelatinous and dark, and their layers are not stratified like that. They're more well mixed into the lichen body. We also have some questions about asexual reproduction. So to further elaborate on asexual reproduction, that is a means of creating another propagule or creating a new individual of lichens that has the exact same genetic makeup as the parent individual. So essentially this happens either by simply breaking the lichen. If you have a Foliose lichen, for example, that gets stepped on and a little corner breaks off, it can distribute itself to another section of rock or another boulder in a field far away. It's dispersed far. And then that offers this opportunity to have a new individual establish itself. And so essentially, the more individuals of a given lichen there are, the greater the chances of that species survival. So that's why asexual reproduction is a very important process for these lichen species. And if we have any more questions, feel free to put them in the comments. Okay, we have a request for more information about lichen substances, such as the usnic acid and periotin, and the other antibacterial properties of lichens. So lichens have been used for these chemical properties for many centuries. I know, for example, usnic acid has been used for its abilities to serve as an antibacterial remedy. It was traditionally used in different substances as a form of medicine. And we also see different lichen chemicals being used in products such as deodorant. So there's still a wide variety of uses. We've kind of moved away from the more medical home remedies of lichens into more practical products such as the litmus paper, different deodorants. I know there are lichen teas for sale in different countries where lichens are readily available. So there's just a lot of properties. There's beliefs lichens can serve as remedies for stomach ailments or as laxatives. There's many different properties of lichens, but there are also lichens that are very lethal, very toxic. So kind of a fine line when you're trying to use these lichens for these properties. It's always important to really know what specific chemistry they have.
Thank you so much for all of the information, Piper. And we want to wish everybody to join us in the future for our programs. And thank you so much.
Thank you.